Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. First time in Goa, and listening to the conversation with the two ministers of the government, I can sense an enormous amount of passion and energy and progress already in the last 18 months. So congratulations to all of you. As someone who's lived in the U.S. but is at heart an Indian, even after 40 years in the U.S., it makes me proud to see that the trend in economic growth is now back in the range that Minister Sinha was talking about, 8 to 10%. Clearly it fell below that, but now it's on the way back. But there is a giant gap between GDP growth in India and jobs growth in India, and this gap is going to grow much larger in the next 10 years, and if we don't address it, we will lose the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to take advantage of our so-called demographic dividends. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. And I wanted to share some insights and also share some policy ideas, and they're only ideas. In the end, you will have to determine how good they are. And not all the ideas are new. Some of them are new, some of them are refined versions of ideas that have been floating around. But I've tried to put them all together into one package. In the 7 years ending 2012, which is the last year for which statistical information is available, even though India's GDP growth was 54%, India's job growth was 3%. We only created 15 million new jobs during that 7-year period. Now, in addition to that, we transitioned 37 million people from agriculture into other sectors, primarily construction, but the fact remains that we had essentially no job growth, even though we had 54% economic growth. We have total employment in this country of 475 million, but the number of people with formal jobs, which are defined to be jobs where employees have contracts and have social benefits, is only 35 million. That's only 7% of the total. So 93% of the people in the country are working on contracts, somewhere between full-time and only a few hours a year. If you look at the quality of the people we have in our workforce, using the metric formal jobs is not a good approach, even though that's the approach that the Indian government uses, because the labor regulations that we have are so restrictive that they cause workers or cause employers to take workers on contract even if they are full-time employees. So the number of formal employees does not fully recognize the number of full-time employees that we have, or the number of full-time employees with what I would call quality jobs. And I would define a quality job to be that of a skilled worker, full-time job, at least 15,000 rupees a month, at least 1.8 lakhs a year. So in that context, historically we've had a big problem, but let me tell you why this problem gets worse in the next 10 years. In the next 10 years, if Minister Sinha achieves what I believe is achievable, and we have, let's say, average growth somewhere between 8 and 10%, that means our GDP growth, our economic growth as measured by the GDP, will be 80, 90, 100%. But the forecast for job creation during that same 10-year period is only 6% job growth. So you have 100% or 80% economic growth, and down here you have 6% job growth. The last 7 years, 54% GDP growth, 3% job growth. And the key point I'm trying to make is that there is a giant problem here to be solved, and I'm hopeful that the smart people in this room will focus on this problem together with the other problems we're working on in India and do something about it. Fundamentally, if I try and give you the two metrics which define the problem that we have to solve in the next 10 years, if nothing changes from the current trajectory, there will be 50 million more unemployed, skilled and semi-skilled people 10 years from now than there are today. that will destroy the notion of the demographic dividend. And from a skilling standpoint, and I know that the Indian government has a number of noteworthy and very important skilling initiatives, but we have to skill something like 100 to 200 million people. But since not all skilling is the same and not all levels of skilling are equally important, there's about 30 to 40 million people we need to skill for high quality positions, particularly in the manufacturing and services industries. So if I just summarize the two most important problems we need to address: how do we create 30 to 40 million more jobs than we have in the current trajectory, and how do we skill 30 or 40 million more people than we have in the current trajectory, and in both cases particularly applied to manufacturing and services, because the relationship between agriculture and construction is very complex, and there is a huge migration that goes on from agriculture to construction, and I'm not going to focus on that today. If you think about the root cause reasons for why these problems exist, because these provide the foundation for policy solutions that we might adopt, there's a long list of culprits. But the first thing is that economic planning, which all governments do, and the Indian government does particularly well, needs to be accompanied by job growth planning. Because if you have economic planning and we get 13% growth or 8% growth, and there is no corresponding job growth planning, we may have a fantastic economy, but that doesn't mean that the lot of the average person is going to improve. And that's really critical for us to address. A second key issue is that we have many good initiatives, we have many good teams, we have a great vision, but the initiatives in the different ministries are all run like silos, and till we have integration across these different initiatives, we will sub-optimize the outcomes that we can achieve. But because we don't measure the outcomes that we are actually achieving, we don't even know what we are missing. But I would more or less bet that if we were to measure the outcomes, we would find that the lack of integration between all the job creation initiatives and all the skilling initiatives is a significant sub-optimizing factor. A third factor is that the economy and the production of all kinds of goods is becoming a lot more capital intensive, partly because of import intensity, partly because of automation. So the end result is that per unit of GDP growth, there is less than a proportional unit of job growth. Then you have the fact that we have growth in sectors that are not particularly jobs intensive, like the financial sector. And then you have a whole bunch of other reasons that I could talk about. But fundamentally, these are the root cause drivers for why we have such a huge shortfall in job growth. So, looking forward, I'd like to propose, particularly to the ministers of the Indian government, and I discussed this with Prime Minister Modi a few months ago, we need to set a vision where we are going to be the world leader in job creation, and we are going to do that by accelerating entrepreneurship, and in particular focusing on growth in the small and medium business sector. And I'll talk about why that's really important. Secondly, we need to become a nation of skills, and to do that, we have to make vocational education as important as college education. Because if we don't do that, our vocational strategies are not going to be successful. So what I'd like to now propose to you are two different playbooks. One policy playbook for creating 30 million or more new jobs over and above the existing baseline, and a second playbook for skilling 30 or 40 million people for high quality jobs over and above the existing baseline. If I start with job creation, the first thing we can do as a policy is to make entrepreneurship education more or less universal. We should make entrepreneurship part of the core curriculum in every engineering and business school we have in India, and in addition, we should make it part of the core curriculum in 3,000 to 5,000 other colleges as well, And if you work through all the maths that comes from that, it potentially produces 500,000 new entrepreneurs a year, not the Flipkarts and not the Snapdeals, because they are going to get financed anyway. You don't have to worry about the Flipkarts and the Snapdeals. You do have to worry about propagating entrepreneurship in Jharkhand or in Bihar or in other states in India where it is not in fact part of the existing DNA. So starting with entrepreneurship education and making it part of the co-curriculum, key part of the agenda. The second thing, we talk about Startup India. It's a fantastic initiative. The Prime Minister's vision and commitment to that is absolutely right on the mark. But we have to make it easy for startups to actually succeed. So beyond the vision, to make this happen, there is a package of policies that needs to be put into place, all the way from simple online 24-hour registration of companies to simple online reporting to central and local and state authorities, to the easy ability to protect intellectual property, to removing restrictive labor regulations from startups, to ease of bankruptcy laws so that if a startup fails, which some will, it's easy for them to go out of business. So we have to take this entire package and try and capture it if we want to make it easy for startups to do business. The third key policy is to really reward small and medium business growth. The focus today is on policies that serve the micro segment, and yet the biggest opportunity for growth is actually in the small and medium business segment. And all of the regulations that we have in our MSME ministry or in other ministries actually are obstacles to going from being a micro business where you may have 3 employees to becoming a small business where you may have 10 employees to becoming a medium business where you may have 30 or 50 or 100 employees. And in every other developing country, biggest job creation happens in small and medium businesses, and yet we are the only country who actually try and restrict that growth. So there are a number of policies we need to implement to make growth in small and medium business a reality. A fourth key policy applies to these different clusters that we have. We have a total of 1,100 modern clusters in India, but these clusters are not particularly well segmented in terms of which ones have the opportunity for maximum job growth. And by putting a much larger amount of funding behind those clusters that have the opportunity for highest growth, we would see a significant acceleration of jobs in those clusters. The fifth policy would be to establish a startup and small and medium business, SMB business, growth corporation, which manages all the different incubators that we are setting up in this country and which facilitates all of these different programs for small and medium growth. The sixth policy is one that we've discussed with several ministries in the government, and there seems to be a positive response, is to establish a small business innovation research program at large scale where we award maybe 25,000 innovation grants over the next 5 years, and these could come from the Ministry of Defense, or they could come from DST, they could come from the Ministry of the Environment. But the idea would be to create the kinds of innovations that the Minister talked about a few minutes ago, to accelerate that and to make them happen across thousands of companies and not just in a few large companies. I think there's a big opportunity for job creation in establishing SMB, small and medium business ecosystems that in particular serve defense, serve the digital infrastructure, and other important initiatives in the railways, so that we can create these pockets of high-value manufacturing that will also accelerate job growth. Finally, we could give tax incentives to angel investors who stay in their investments for the long term, kind of as VCs do in the tech companies, but the VCs don't do it in the millions of non-tech companies that we need. So we need to facilitate angel investors. And from a debt standpoint, virtually every small and medium-sized company that we have talked to in India says that it's virtually impossible for them to get debt financing. So forget the trillions of dollars in bond financing that we might need. At the level of a small or medium-sized company, can we make it easy for them to get loans of 10 lakhs or 25 lakhs or 1 crore? So this would be the package of policy ideas that has the potential to create maybe 30 or 40 million more jobs than the current trajectory will allow us to do. Now, if I take the other side of this equation, which is skilling, similarly, there's a huge opportunity to do more than what we are doing on today's trajectory. And the first policy idea here would be the vocationalization of high schools. So we have 40,000 public high schools today. Virtually none of them actually provide any vocational education. And our proposal would be that we take 25% of them, or 10,000 of them, and actually make them vocational high schools, where immediately coming out of the high school, the students are employment ready. By doing that, we believe we'll be able to skill 5 to 8 million additional people beyond the current trajectory. The second key area is our ITIs, our Industrial Training Institutes, which have fallen into disrepair. But if we take the 2,000 government-owned and controlled ITIs and transform them in a number of different ways, we have the potential to double their capacity and also increase the placement rate, and that will add another 5 to 7 million skilled people into the workforce. If you take a third area, which is our community colleges, we have about 150 community colleges, but they are not actually providing an output of students who are actually getting placed in jobs. So we can transform and expand our community college system to place several million more people into productive jobs. If we take a fourth area, which is the employers and the vocational training providers, we need to connect them a lot more closely with an incentive scheme that makes them want to actually deliver and place students rather than simply receiving equity from the government or receiving debt from the government. They actually need to be rewarded based on the outcomes that they achieve. We need a massive apprenticeships program in India, because if we are going to add another 30 or 40 million people, skilled, high-quality jobs to the workforce, this is not going to happen without apprenticeships. So we need to provide an ability for employers to want to take on apprentices, and one way to do that would be to give them tax credits. Another way to do that would be to give them credits against their CSR responsibilities or the CSR obligations. We need to dramatically improve the curriculum, and today's curriculum is archaic, and not only does it need to be upgraded to the standards that India needs for the future, but it also needs to be made flexible. So in China, they've implemented a phenomenally successful vocational education system. Only 1/3 of the curriculum is determined at the national level, 1/3 is determined at the regional level, and 1/3 is actually determined at the town or the cluster level within a town. And while that may be too complicated for India, we should at least allow for some flexibility, maybe 20 or 30% of the curriculum to actually be established at the local level. We need to massively increase and professionalize the faculty for vocational training. There are no accreditation standards in India for vocational training faculty. We're about 250,000 teachers short in terms of getting the job done. And we have an enormous opportunity here to fix that problem, and in doing that, to accelerate skilling and placing these additional people in high-quality jobs. We need a governance body. So as UGC is to school and college education, we need the UGC of vocational education to establish standards, to review curriculums, to establish standardized testing procedures, and to provide the accreditation for teachers. And finally, we need an absolute commitment to measuring outcomes, because if we are going to have continuous improvement in our vocational education system and in our skilling system, it's not going to happen if we don't know what the results are of all these different initiatives. So the end result is we don't know how to improve because we don't know what we've actually achieved. So having a national database of skilling outcomes and skilling impact, I think, is going to be very critical. So these were two playbooks that I've gone through very quickly. Obviously, there's a lot more detail behind it that we can get into. But I think India has an enormous opportunity to be a leader on the world stage in terms of both job creation and skilling. It's not an easy journey by any means, but if I had to give you the magic key to actually making this kind of journey successful, it comes down to four basic things. So just as Parag said, implementation, 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 in this particular case, the first thing is integration. We've got to integrate across the different policies that the different ministries are working on. The second thing is simplicity. We have to get rid of a lot of regulations that are no longer serving a good purpose. They may have served a good purpose once, 20 years ago or 50 years ago, but this is not the right time or the right place to have those regulations, and we need to simplify. The third is execution, which is we really have to have a passionate focus on actually executing the policies that we are talking about. And the fourth thing is measurement, because if we want continuous improvement, we need measurement. So this is a difficult journey. It's a journey that needs to be done. It's a journey that can be done, and it's a journey that must be done. Thank you.